Jesus Christ, and to have every student have a chance to respond to this wonderful news. And Grace Toronto Church is a local downtown church located at the corner of Jarvis and Carleton, seeking to serve the City of Toronto. Both organizations seek to live life and help Christians live life in light of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So tonight's topic of physician-assisted death and a Christian response to this and the idea of mercy is quite relevant. It's not a theoretical topic that we're here to just ponder about and leave as an abstract idea. Suffering is something that we will all encounter, both either in our lives personally or through a loved one, a family member, a parent, or someone close to us. So our speaker tonight is going to help us think about how we should respond to suffering. As Christians, how do we respond to the practice of physician-assisted death? Is this a permissible act? Is it even an effective means of dealing with the problem underlying the situation, the problem of suffering? So tonight's talk will be given by Dr. Ewan Goligher, but before I invite him up, I'd just like to give a few housekeeping rules. So there is food at the back available for those coming in who need a quick bite to eat. Ewan will talk on this topic for about 35 minutes, and there will be an opportunity for questions afterwards. If you'd like, you can raise your hand for questions at the end of the talk, but there will also be a phone number sent out that you can text questions anonymously. So if you have any questions that you want sent in, save them in your phone during the talk, and we'll give you the number at the end. So Dr. Goligher is a friend of mine. We're both members of the Network of Christian Scholars. He's been quite instrumental in that organization. But he's also a physician working here in Toronto. He holds degrees in biochemistry and medicine from the University of British Columbia, and he recently just completed his PhD in physiology at the University of Toronto. He has a specialist certification in internal medicine and intensive care medicine, and his research focuses on the impact of mechanical ventilation on the lungs and muscles of breathing. As an ICU physician, he frequently cares for patients at the end of their lives, and his work on the issue of physician-assisted death and conscientious objection has been published in academic medical journals and a variety of press media. You may have even seen him quoted recently in the Globe and Mail just today. He and his family live here in Toronto. They attend Grace Fellowship Church in Don Mills, and that is all I have to say about Ewan. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Goligher. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, Darius, for the kind introduction. It's really an honor to be invited to speak to you all this evening. I'd like to thank Pastor Choi and our gracious hosts from Grace Toronto and Power to Change for their efforts in making this event happen.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
Just want to make sure everyone hears you.
Some of us are hard hearing you.
Okay.
Gotta speak closer to the mic, Ewan. Sorry.
Okay, sure. If at any point you can't hear me, just wave and I'll...
I will. There you go.
Okay.
Sorry.
We're gathered here this evening to contemplate a difficult and pressing issue. Canadian healthcare has entered a brave new world with the recent legalization of physician-assisted death. Until June 6, deliberately causing the death of a patient was a criminal act, an act that carried severe legal penalties and was once viewed as an unforgivable violation of the covenant between physician and patient. Social mores, however, have changed considerably in the last few years, and in the face of this shift, medical ethical conventions have proven to be surprisingly fluid. Physician-assisted death, or simply assisted death as I will refer to it throughout this talk, is now widely lauded as a means of showing respect and compassion. Indeed, it has assumed the stature of a moral imperative. Assisted death ought to be provided by doctors, nurses, and hospitals. To refuse to do so, as some of us have, is viewed by many as a selfish lack of concern for patient welfare and patient rights, refusing to deliberately cause patient death, whether directly or indirectly, once considered the heart and soul of the physician's moral integrity, is now seen as a lack of compassion. The shifting moral landscape on assisted death has put a new and unexpected pressure on Christians. Those of us who are Christian generally regard our faith as a religion of love. Love toward God and love to our fellow man, especially to those who are suffering or marginalized. We hold up Jesus of Nazareth, our master, teacher, and Lord, as the very paradigm of mercy and compassion. Accordingly, we wish to be seen by society as merciful and compassionate, and we hope that in being seen this way, test.
Apologies if this out of battery. Sorry, there's another one here.
Great, thank you. Accordingly, we wish to be seen by society as at large as merciful and compassionate. And we hope that in being seen this way, we will give glory to God and draw others to join us in following Christ. Yet Christians, along with our Jewish forebears, have traditionally refused to take human life except as a means of self-defense or criminal justice. So now, in light of the new ethics, our Christian commitment risks appearing callous and uncaring rather than merciful and compassionate. How then should Christians respond? How can we remain faithful to our Christian commitment and yet respond to the issue of assisted death in a manner that makes clear our commitment to mercy and compassion? Must Christians oppose assisted death? If so, what are we opposing exactly? Is assisted death the answer to intractable suffering? Can we propose a better way? In the face of suffering and brokenness, what is the shape of Christian mercy? These are the questions that press in on us this evening. To begin, we must stare in the face the grim reality of human suffering. Working in the intensive care unit, I do not have to think long and hard to find myriad examples of what seems like unbearable suffering. Haunting visions of the tear-strewn face of family members learning that their loved one would not survive or recover from sudden trauma or illness. Of wives pleading and begging with their dying husbands to stay with them. Of children sitting silent at the bedside trying to come to terms with the loss of their mother. Of husband and wife saying their final parting goodbyes. Of patients left prisoners in their bodies as the result of stroke or spinal cord injury. I could go on. One particular patient stands out in my mind. Robin, that's not his real name, was 29 years old. He came to my ICU with pneumonia and temporarily required life support from a ventilator. Only 14 months before, he was in the prime of health, energetically pursuing his interests and goals. Then a spinal cord injury left him paralyzed from the shoulders down. He could breathe and talk and move his head and little else. He lived in a long-term care facility. For a time, his mother and sister visited him frequently, but then their visits grew more infrequent. He saw them now only occasionally. The monotony of life was interrupted by occasional medical complications related to quadriplegia and immobility. I remember speaking with him after he recovered from the pneumonia and came off the ventilator. We were making preparations to return him to the long-term care facility that he came from. Lying in the bed, pale and emaciated, his arms and legs unmoving, he spoke with a thin and raspy voice, and his tone was pleading and desperate. "Please don't make me go back there," he said. "They ignore me. They don't come when I ring the bell. It's too far for my family to come and visit, so I hardly see them." He asked us to transfer him to a different long-term care facility closer to his mother and sister where they could visit more often. Unfortunately, within the constraints of our healthcare system and the extended waits for long-term placement, this kind of facility change is simply not a possibility. Regretfully, I advised that we had to send him back. "No, please don't," he cried. "Please don't send me back there. They don't care about me at all there. I'm going to die there. Please don't send me back." In that moment, he felt utterly helpless and alone, and so did I. His injury had condemned him to a life of loneliness and helplessness, a deep and profound kind of suffering for which no prescription would serve to help. As an ICU physician with the powers of technology and pharmacotherapy at my disposal, there was nothing I could offer for that kind of pain. Those of us who pursue medicine often envision the joy of relieving suffering, of making the diagnosis, of delivering the cure. We toil for years, decades even, to learn the art and science of selecting the right drug for the right patient at the right dose at the right time. But perhaps the most important lesson we learn in all of our medical training is the fact of our limitation. There are so many things for which we can do so little. It is this medical void of limitation and hopelessness that assisted death steps in to fill. Advocacy for mercy killing is nothing new. It was practiced long before Hippocrates and even for centuries after he issued his famous oath. The practice didn't really fade until the cultural ascendancy of Christianity in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. Historical records show particularly active social debate on this issue in the West in the late 19th century and again in the decade preceding the Second World War. The current movement in favor of assisted death has been gaining momentum for several decades, and its present success in Canada owes much to the simplicity of their case and the increasing match between its underlying assumptions and the basic attitudes and beliefs of Canadians. Before we examine the arguments for assisted death, it's worth pausing to carefully define what we mean by assisted death. Assisted death is widely regarded as one end of a continuum between aggressive pain and symptom management, limiting life-sustaining therapy, terminal sedation, assisted suicide, and euthanasia. The critical feature distinguishing assisted death from these other interventions lies in its intention. When providing assisted death, the physician deliberately intends to cause death. The doctor selects the drug and dose with the specific intent of causing death. Now, some respond that the overarching intention of assisted death is to relieve suffering and provide comfort. That may be so, but the comfort is achieved by causing death. Note that we are not concerned about whether this intent to cause death is carried out by active or passive means. Those who intentionally cause death by refusing to help are as morally culpable as those who intentionally cause death by some active intervention. Rather, the critical issue is that in assisted death, and not in those other interventions, we are deliberately taking aim at ending life. Drawing this line in the sand brings great clarity to the conversation. Palliative care with diligent and aggressive and effective pain and symptom management is not intended to end the patient's life. If anything, studies suggest that such care may actually prolong life in some cases. Palliative care is therefore categorically different from assisted death. High-dose morphine or other opioids required to control severe or refractory pain may have the theoretically foreseeable effect of limiting the patient's breathing and hastening death. But inasmuch as such therapy is not intended at ending the patient's life, but rather at alleviating pain, it is strongly justifiable.
Hello?
Okay. I hope you guys have a lot of these. All right. Inasmuch as such therapy with high-dose morphine and other opioids is not aimed at ending the patient's life, but rather at alleviating pain, it is entirely justifiable. Death in this case is a potentially foreseen, but unintended effect. I should note that this concern about hastening death is almost never observed in clinical practice. Properly dosed and delivered, opioids are an extremely safe and effective means of relieving pain and shortness of breath at the end of life. Withholding or withdrawing life-sustaining therapy, such as I do in the ICU, is not the same as assisted death. Withholding or withdrawing is properly viewed as the cessation of therapy, not the initiation of therapy. Withdrawing life support is intended to liberate the patient from a burdensome intervention that in their particular case has become pointless, as it is no longer offering the opportunity for a meaningful recovery. We may also withhold or withdraw life support because patients are not prepared to endure invasive and burdensome interventions given their goals and values. And it would be wrong to force life support in such cases. Such an intervention would be a kind of assault. I've personally ordered the withdrawal of life support many countless times. In a few of those cases, the patient was actually awake and able to request withdrawal of life support. I have never taken someone off of life support in order to end their life. In doing so, I am not trying to end their life. Death is, again, a foreseeable but unintended consequence. In fact, a small minority of patients don't even die immediately after the withdrawal of life support, so death is not even a necessary consequence of withdrawal, and the goals of withdrawal can be achieved whether or not the patient actually dies. I've been at pains to distinguish these forms of medical care from assisted death so that we may be very clear about what we oppose. In opposing assisted death, we are opposing medical acts that deliberately aim at ending the patient's life. Now, traditionally, the idea of using medicine to deliberately end the patient's life was greeted with recoil and horror, but this is no longer the case. A large majority of Canadians now support assisted death. Within the medical community, a minority of physicians are willing to provide assisted death, but the majority seem to be willing to provide referrals upon patient request. Outright opposition to assisted death is quite limited. How did this come to be the case? Quite simply, I believe, the advocates of assisted death have made a clear case for their view that seems compelling and even irrefutable in our current mental environment. The case in favor of assisted death therefore warrants careful attention. The case for assisted death is built on two foundational principles: compassion and respect. In what sense is causing death deemed compassionate? According to advocates, assisted death should be provided because it is a means of deliverance from otherwise unavoidable suffering. For those with grievous and irremediable suffering, as the justices of the Supreme Court put it, death brings relief from suffering. It offers an escape from the inescapable burden of an unwanted life. In the United States, 18 months ago, writing on CNN.com, Brittany Maynard, a young woman who famously died by assisted death, explained, "Even with palliative medication, I could potentially develop morphine-resistant pain and suffer personality changes and verbal, cognitive, and motor loss of virtually any kind. Because the rest of my body is young and healthy, I am likely to physically hang on for a long time, even though cancer is eating my mind. I probably would have suffered in hospice care for weeks or even months, and my family would have had to watch that." It's impossible to read those concerns without feeling sympathy or something of the desperation that Brittany must have felt when faced with such a prospect. Death with dignity, as she called it, promised a way of escaping such prospects. In this sense, then, assisted death is said to be compassionate. The second foundational principle in support of assisted death is respect. Assisted death is said to be respectful of patient dignity in that it is centered upon their preferences and choices. It maximizes the patient's control over their life and affords them the opportunity to control the timing and conditions of their death, circumstances that up until recently were widely held to be beyond our control. Over the last several decades, respect for patient autonomy has come to assume a central place in medical ethics, such that it is now the primary principle upon which ethical judgments are made. Respect for autonomy embodies the idea of self-rule or self-governance and requires that the patient be placed in charge of his or her care. In the current ethos of medicine, respecting autonomy is essentially synonymous with honoring the dignity and value of the patient. It's on this basis that some have argued that assisted death is morally acceptable, even morally imperative. In their seminal paper supporting the ethics or permissibility of assisted death, a group of prominent Canadian bioethicists state, "If autonomy is, as we claim that it is, a central constitutional value, then it quite clearly grounds the right to request assistance in dying according to one's considered and stable views about when one's own life is not worth living any longer. Assisted death, then, is quite simply a matter of respect. To refuse to allow someone to control the manner and timing of their death is accordingly profoundly disrespectful in this view. In the words of Brittany Maynard, "I am dying, and I want to die on my own terms. I would not tell anyone else that he or she could choose death with dignity. My question is, who has the right to tell me that I don't deserve this choice? That I deserve to suffer for weeks or months in tremendous amounts of physical and emotional pain? Why should anyone have the right to make that choice for me?" With her family in attendance, Brittany made her final choice on November the 1st, 2014. The case for assisted death, then, is simple, clear, and perhaps at first glance, compelling. Compassion and respect. Who can oppose such principles? Indeed, how can this case be opposed? In engaging this issue, we must begin by observing that the belief that assisted death is a good thing is grounded in a particular view of who we are as humans and how we establish what is good. There is a broader view of the world that we inhabit at play in this matter of life and death. We cannot hope to engage the matter of assisted death in any serious and convincing way without taking account of this view, without understanding it and challenging it. Once we identify and understand this view, we may examine its assumptions and discover whether it is sound or fatally flawed. So in the time that remains, I wish to briefly sketch the contours of this system and to present some basic assumptions and implications of this system as they pertain to the matter of assisted death. We will then bring the fundamental features of Christian belief to bear on these same issues and draw some conclusions about the proper Christian response to the present controversy over end-of-life care. The basic view of the world adhered to by most advocates of assisted death might be termed secular humanism. The core idea of humanism is summarized in the famous words of Protagoras, the ancient Greek philosopher. Man is the measure of all things. Humanists believe that the fundamental questions of our existence, truth, beauty, goodness, value, and meaning, must be decided through the sole reliance upon human reason and human powers of observation. Of course, such a belief expresses a great deal of faith in the reliability of human reason and perception. But humanists appeal to advances in knowledge, in science, in support of this belief. Humanists are committed to promoting human flourishing and welfare, and they aim to do so by the application of the human intellect to every domain of life. In the domain of ethics, humans are held to be the final arbiters of right and wrong. We must decide for ourselves. We are the measure. External authorities, in particular divine authority, are not permitted to have any real say. In this sense, modern humanism is secular with a capital S. It does not necessarily discount the idea of God outright, but it excludes God from any meaningful role in decision-making. Thus, it is functionally atheistic. Importantly, humanists take this functional atheism to signify a kind of worldview neutrality. In the words of the aforementioned eminent body of Canadian ethicists, religious people might choose to avail themselves of the guidance provided by their respective religions, but it is unreasonable to enforce normative views derived from claims about a God uniformly on a societal level, given the multicultural and multi-faith nature of Canada in the 21st century. I want you to see the irony. It is insisted that we cannot allow any particular religious view to govern a multicultural and pluralistic society. So, in the name of neutrality, the authors require us to all opt for a particular view that requires that we act and think as if all these other views are wrong. Secular humanism is not at all neutral. The conclusions of secular humanism in matters of ethics are inevitably and necessarily informed by its assumptions about human value and the basis for discerning good and evil. Now let me point out 3 ways in which these assumptions are manifest in the matter of assisted death. First, advocates of assisted death assume that they have knowledge of what it is like to be dead. Earlier, we recognized that the case for assisted death rests on the belief that death is an act of compassion. In cases of unwanted suffering, death is actually said to be good for you. But the fact of the matter is that we have no idea, on secular terms, what it is like to be dead. Human reason and perception have no means of confidently discerning whether or not there is life after death, and if there is, what it would be like. Within the confines of secular presupposition and modes of knowledge, these questions are simply beyond our ken. This problem is particularly pressing for medicine, as all claims of benefit for patients are supposed to be grounded in observational evidence. This is, after all, the defining feature of modern scientific medicine. There's no place for wishful thinking in medical decision-making, yet inasmuch as assisted death blindly presumes that death is good for you, it seems very much to qualify as a case of wishful thinking. Thus, secular humanists cannot adequately justify their claim that assisted death is compassionate. Second, advocates of assisted death
we've got a truckload of these.
It's got fresh batteries.
Okay, great. I'm glad you came prepared. Second, advocates of assisted death assume that human autonomy deserves to be respected above every competing priority. Autonomy, or self-rule, is assumed to be the foundation for all other values, including the value of life and the value of persons. The significance of this assumption cannot be underestimated. It massively shifts the very meaning and purpose of medicine. Whereas medicine was formerly primarily aimed at advancing the welfare of the patient, the supremacy of autonomy requires that medicine be instead primarily aimed at satisfying preferences. In other words, the patient's welfare is defined entirely in terms of the patient's preferences. Patients are benefited only insofar as their preferences are satisfied. But is respect for autonomy the answer to our need for a moral foundation for medicine? I would argue no, for two reasons. First, it simply doesn't work. When a patient goes to his physician and asks for a prescription for a powerful opioid painkiller, the doctor must naturally be concerned with why the patient wants it. If the patient says that he is in fact in no pain, but simply desires the euphoria attached to the use of the drug, then we would expect a doctor to refuse such a prescription. Yet if medicine is genuinely to be aimed purely at satisfying preferences and defining good in terms of what the patient wants, then there are no ethical grounds for such a refusal. If the patient understands and accepts the risks associated with the abuse of opioids, then who is the doctor to say no on this grounds? Yet intuitively we understand that this would seriously undermine the value and greatness of medicine and reduce the doctor's professional role to that of a technician. So by reductio ad absurdum, autonomy cannot serve as the moral foundation for medicine. Second, the principle of respect for autonomy cannot serve as a moral foundation for medicine because by itself it's groundless and arbitrary. In other words, there's no good answer to the question, why should we respect autonomy? Moral philosophers such as Peter Singer, who have advanced the system of ethics, argue that in the absence of objective moral facts, only preferences remain. They further argue that maximizing respect for preferences is the best way of maximizing well-being and minimizing suffering. Yet this whole system presumes that it is an objective moral fact that well-being should be maximized and that suffering should be minimized. So are there objective moral facts or no? And if no, why should we respect preferences? Where does such a rule come from? The lack of an answer to this question is massively problematic for the system of ethics. If there is no reason to believe that we ought to respect preferences, if this is just a blind assumption, then neither is there any reason to believe that we ought to provide assisted death. Moreover, if there is no real basis for the value of human preferences, we have no reason to care about others' well-being. History is full of examples of those who have shown little or no regard for the preferences of others. It's problematic if we can't provide a good reason to think that they're behaving unethically. So once again, secular humanism seems to require unsupportable assumptions in making its case that we ought to provide assisted death. The third secular tenet, essential to the case for assisted death, is that suffering is, in an ultimate sense, pointless and meaningless. This is not so much an assumption of secular humanism as it is an implication of this view of the world. If the world we inhabit and the human race itself results from purely unguided and unintentional forces of time and chance, then there is no actual or objective meaning to our lives. There is no intention, no purpose built into the universe. Suffering is purely the byproduct of the failures of an unguided evolutionary process. Nothing is really wrong or broken with the world per se, because there was no original intention for it to be otherwise. This view of who we are and where we have come from shapes secular ideas of right and wrong, of death and life, even as secularism purports to stand apart as neutral in the marketplace of ideas. Now, philosophers have long recognized that apart from God, life's meaning reduces to a kind of personal fiction, that there is no actual ultimate meaning or purpose. The skeptic Bertrand Russell wrote that our lives must be built on a firm foundation of unyielding despair. The French existentialist playwright Albert Camus likened human existence to that of Sisyphus, the mythical Greek character condemned to spend eternity pushing a large boulder up a steep mountain, only to have the boulder roll down the other side and then do it again for eternity. Life, in other words, is pointless and absurd. This being the case, Camus concluded that the only serious philosophical question, he said, is suicide. In other words, if life is pointless, why stay alive? If this question presses in on us in health, how much more does it weigh on us when we suffer without prospect of deliverance? If life in general is meaningless and absurd, a life of grievous and irremediable suffering is dramatically more so. In this light, it only makes sense to end one's life. Philosopher Thomas Schramm, writing in the International Journal of Law and Psychiatry, argues that suicide can be considered rational when, quote, a person kills herself who can no longer impart meaning to her continued existence, close quote. The real root of the desire for death is not actually the fact of suffering, but the meaninglessness of that suffering. It is despair, not pain, that drives the demand for assisted death. What can we say then to those who stand at the edge of this dark abyss, feeling deeply their loneliness in the universe, the pointlessness of their life, hurting, grieving, angry, despairing? Why should they keep on living? What do we say to those who calmly and coolly choose death, not because of any particular depression or bitterness or despair, but simply because they want to be masters of their own fate? Their time is up as they see it. They're ready to close the book and be done with it. There is no point in their eyes to continued life. I can only think of one answer. That answer is that certain facts of history force us to think that our lives are in fact deeply meaningful, apart from our own subjective judgment, and that our suffering is profoundly significant. 2,000 years ago, a man lived who claimed to be God in human flesh. For that claim, he was crucified in ignominy, suffering horrifically for his unwillingness to recant that claim. Those who devotedly followed him fled in shame and fear, yet just weeks later they were to be found in public, boldly proclaiming that they had seen their master risen from the dead. Indeed, they spent the rest of their lives proclaiming that fact, sacrificing ease, wealth, and ultimately their own lives because they were unwilling to say otherwise. Masses of people in Jerusalem at that time believed, despite the fact that if Jesus really was still dead, they could simply have gone to the grave to confirm that his body was there. These facts and more point to an irresistible conclusion. Jesus Christ had risen from the dead. In doing so, he fulfilled his own prophecies and those of Old Testament prophets from the preceding millennia. His claims were vindicated. If Jesus is risen from the dead, then he is all that he claimed to be: the light of the world, the water of life, the good shepherd, the word of God, the creator of all, the Lord of the universe. If he's risen from the dead, he is the Lord of our lives. It's beyond the scope of this presentation to offer a more complete defense of Christian belief. Nevertheless, I am at pains to point out that the Christian beliefs that shape our view of assisted death, though they are religious in character, are not mere blind assumptions, as if we had some choice as to whether or not we would accept them, or whether or not they were true or false. Rather, we are forced to believe these principles and live in their light because we are convinced of their actual truth by the evidence in their favor. Those who have come to accept the truth claims of Christianity will necessarily view life, death, and suffering in a very different light. Our ideas of meaning, value, and purpose and ethics are radically reshaped by the basic tenets of Christian belief. If Christianity is true, then the universe is not ultimately empty and devoid of meaning. My value is not entirely dependent on my own preferences, and life and suffering are not pointless absurdities. Rather, identity, meaning, purpose, and value are real, deriving from a transcendent, self-existent Creator God. We live and die and suffer for a reason, even if we cannot always discern that reason. We inhabit a universe that, in the words of philosopher William Dembski, is luminous with purpose. To finish, we identified 3 key secular beliefs that inform and guide the secular perspective on assisted death. Let's briefly contrast them with key Christian beliefs that guide the Christian response to assisted death. First, the matter of value and autonomy. Christians recognize that human value is derived from the Creator's intentions, not our own autonomous preferences. We are created in the image of God. We are endowed with godlike cognitive faculties. We were designed to rule and exercise dominion over the created order on God's behalf, to walk in close communion and fellowship with God. In the words of the psalmist, we have been crowned with glory and honor. It is God's delight and pleasure in us, his ultimate intentions for us, that serve as a transcendent foundation for human value. This value is not contingent upon our functional capacities or our quality of life. Rather, it derives from the greatness of God's original intention for us. The value of human persons in the eyes of God is nowhere more clearly displayed than at the cross of Christ. There we see the God of the universe condescend to take on human flesh, share in our infirmities and trials, and suffer and die for us so that we might be reconciled to him. Contemplating the significance of the cross for the practice of medicine, the prominent 17th century English physician Thomas Sydenham, of Sydenham's Korea fame, wrote, "Let the doctor reflect that he has taken the care of no mean creature, for in order that he may estimate the value, the greatness of the human race, the only begotten Son of God became himself a man, and thus ennobled it with his divine dignity, and far more than this, died to redeem it. In consequence, I, as a doctor, cannot take it upon myself to destroy another human person, however voluntarily they may request it. If our value and significance arise from God, then to destroy others and oneself is an act of defiance to God. Moreover, killing does not manifest respect for persons. It demeans and subverts their value. Immanuel Kant, the Enlightenment philosopher, observed that suicide requires that one treat oneself as a means to an end. Treating persons as means to ends, he argued, was the essence of ethical failure. Our patients are the image bearers of God. Accordingly, they are of profound intrinsic value and worth, and we cannot treat them as mere means to ends. Additionally, as created beings, we do not belong to ourselves. We belong to our Creator. Your life is not mine for the taking, and it's not yours for the taking either. In light of this truth, what is the shape of Christian mercy? Christian mercy refuses to participate in the practice of assisted death. Our unwillingness to kill our patients is a declaration of their profound value. In refusing to participate, we proclaim that human value transcends mere human preference. This is a powerful message for those who suffer from chronic disability, chronic physical or mental illness, those who desperately yearn to take their place as full-fledged members of community, but find themselves secretly doubting whether they and the world would be better off if they were gone. Jesus' words, his life, his death, and resurrection proclaimed the value of those who suffer, who are broken and downcast. In refusing to provide assisted death, we take up our cross and we follow him. Practically, how may we defend this stance? The best approach, I think, is simply to pit their assumption against ours. If the secularist asks me, what makes it wrong to intentionally cause death? If the patient is okay with it, I will ask in return, what makes it wrong to refuse autonomous preferences? Unless they can defend this basic assumption of their ethical system, and they can't, in my experience, we should not feel obliged to defend the basic principles of ours. I would only add that Christians, in fact, have very good reasons to believe that we are of great and inviolable intrinsic worth. So that's so much for the matter of value and autonomy. Secondly, the matter of compassion. How do Christians respond on this front? Let's ask ourselves, what's the true meaning of compassion? Etymologically, compassion conveys the idea of suffering with the sufferer, of companionship in suffering. God himself offers a clear example of such compassion. He was not aloof from the brokenness of our world. He could have extinguished the universe and ended all suffering and sin for all time and just started over. Instead, he chose to enter into our suffering, to suffer with us and among us and as one of us. He did not run from our experience. He came to face it with us and for us. His example provides us with a powerful alternate paradigm of compassion. Secular compassion offers extinction as a means of relief from existential pain. Christian compassion offers companionship on your journey through pain. This is not to say that Christian compassion mandates or lionizes unnecessary physical suffering. Physical pain is nearly always treatable. It is nevertheless true that some suffering, particularly existential suffering, cannot be avoided while still alive. So is Christian compassion therefore somehow lacking or inadequate? Let me ask you this question. Is there anything better than freedom from suffering? Is a life of minimal pain really the best possible life? Is freedom from pain sufficient to satisfy our heart's deepest yearnings? Should such a life be our highest aspiration? The answer, I believe, is no. Greater even than our need for freedom from suffering is our need for love. True, deep, unwavering, unselfish love. The kind of love that can only be experienced when we feel that we have little or nothing to offer, when we are completely and utterly dependent on the other. To be loved under such circumstances, when the lover has nothing to gain by us, is to discover just how much we are worth. This is exactly the kind of need that Christ-like compassion is aimed at. The very heart of the Christian message is that God has nothing to gain from us, and yet he loves us and treasures us and invites us to rest in his freely given, unconditional, unfailing, unrelenting love. It is the compassion of God that for Christians that shapes and motivates Christian compassion. Freely you have received, freely give. What then in this light is the shape of Christian mercy? Rather than offering the path of extinction or early exit, we must join the suffering in their journey to the end. This is the hard road. There's nothing easy about walking with the suffering. Nothing easy about loving those who have very little to give us in return. In many ways, offering the patient a bolus concoction of midazolam, propofol, thiopental, rocuronium, and potassium chloride is far easier. It costs little in time or money. Indeed, the government of Ontario has offered to provide the drugs for free. As Christians, we must renew our commitment to walk with those who are suffering, to be their faithful traveling companions on their difficult journey. Practically, this means that Christian organizations, including churches, must begin to think about how they can effectively minister to those who are suffering and dying in our communities. Christian healthcare professionals must become absolutely skilled in palliative care and pain and symptom management. We must find ways to be with our patients, for them to sense our love and respect. All Christians need to be prepared to give generously of their time and their money to meet the needs of the suffering, aged, disabled, and dying in our communities. At this juncture, At the beginning of this new era of assisted death, we must set ourselves to display the loving and costly character of Christian compassion. Lastly, there is the matter of suffering's meaning. Can suffering possibly have a purpose? We who are Christians believe that it does. First, suffering has a message. It screams brokenness. It cries out for explanation. It demands our attention. Something is wrong with the world, it says. Things are supposed to be different. Somehow we know that in our bones. Every time we mourn our suffering, we are implying that things ought to be otherwise. And this presumes some ideal state of affairs, some original intention that has been lost. This in turn presumes a source of intention, an intender, if you will. Thus, suffering itself carries within it the seeds of our salvation, for it points us to the one who can deliver us from suffering for all eternity. For those of us who have chosen to follow Christ, suffering takes on an even greater purpose. 2 Corinthians 4:17 says, "For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory that is beyond all comparison." John Piper, referring to this text, said, "Not only is all your affliction momentary, not only is all your affliction light in comparison to eternity and the glory there, but all of it is totally meaningful. Every millisecond of your pain from the fallen nature of fallen man, every millisecond of your misery on the path of obedience is producing a peculiar glory you will get because of that. I don't care if it was cancer or criticism. I don't care if it was slander or sickness. It wasn't meaningless. It's doing something." Of course you can't see what it's doing. Don't look to what is seen. When your mom dies, when your kid dies, when you've got cancer at 40, when a car careens into the sidewalk and takes her out, don't say, "That's meaningless." It's not. It's working for you an eternal weight of glory. Thus, it is the gospel, the good news that God has reconciled us to himself and called us to share in his eternal glory, radically transforms our suffering to something deeply meaningful. Exactly how suffering and glory are connected is somewhat mysterious. Nevertheless, the gospel enables us to live with meaning and purpose even as we are dying. The gospel is the real antidote to despair. If the dark prison of despair drives us to seek death to be free of our suffering, genuine meaning and purpose free us to embrace life, to live even as we suffer. And so we must respond to assisted death by renewing our burden and zeal to speak the gospel, a message of meaning and purpose into our culture through word and deed. So to sum up, I have sought to carefully define what it is that we are opposing in opposing assisted death. We have laid out the case for assisted death and examined some of the key assumptions required for this case to make sense. We have recognized some critical problems with these assumptions, problems that give us reasons to seriously question the case for assisted death. At the same time, we have seen that the facts of history regarding the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ dramatically transform our view of suffering and dying and assisted death. The true basis of human value and the true nature of compassion are powerfully communicated through the cross of Christ. Human value depends not on shifting human preference, but on the intention of a transcendent creator. Genuine compassion is loving companionship on the journey through pain rather than facilitating an early exit. Much more could be said. In the days and months ahead, the Christian community must come together in mutual love and support to work out in deeper and more practical terms just what is the shape of Christian mercy in the face of this issue. Please pray for those doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and other therapists you know who are caught up in this issue. Pray that we will be faithful even under pressure. If anything, the conversation around assisted death will press the Church of Christ in our time to pursue greater likeness to Christ as individuals and as a body. For this, we can only be thankful. Thank you very much.
So, Ewan's given us quite a bit to think about. I'm sure his talk has raised many questions. So, as I mentioned before, if you'd like to text in a question to send something in anonymously, you can do so to the following number. It's 416-830-0335. Again, that's 416-830-0335. I'd like to invite you back up to take any questions. So if there are any questions from the audience, or if any come in to the phone, I'll take those as well. Yes, over here.
For the people who are elderly, shall we say, and might be wondering about assisted dying, I'd just be interested to know how active is hospice care here in Toronto? Is that widely available or rarely available to make their last days as meaningful as possible and at home if possible?
That's a phenomenal question, and I think you're getting to the heart of what it means practically to respond to this issue. It's been surprising, I think, to many doctors how frequent this issue has been raised by patients. Maybe the interest in seeking this out has been a little more than we anticipated, and that may be in large part related to the fact that awareness about alternative options is relatively limited. So I think in Toronto, actually, we are, in general, well supported in terms of the availability of hospice care, the availability of palliative care services, and it's something certainly that family doctors can help connect their patients with. If you're in hospital, many hospitals have an inpatient palliative care service that will consult and look after patients. Some hospitals actually have hospices inside of them, but there are many hospices that aren't attached to hospitals as well. Not being a palliative care physician, I don't personally have a good sense of the wait time for beds or those kinds of issues. And certainly there are many areas of the country where the availability of palliative care is not nearly as good as it is here. And I think this is a very important priority. And the reality is that when, for example, the Royal Society of Canada issued its report on end-of-life care in Canada, one of their important conclusions was that assisted death was reasonable and ethical. But they also concluded that there needs to be a great deal done to improve the delivery of end-of-life care in general. The challenge is, of course, getting the political will to do that, getting the healthcare funding set aside to improve the availability of those services. And so I think that's really what Canadians should be crying out for, demanding, speaking out for, requesting, is to ensure that they have access to those things. The drugs for assisted death are freely available. Why aren't the pain medication for palliative care also freely available?
We have a couple of questions coming in on the phone. I'll just ask one quick one first. Someone was asking if you could clarify the difference, again, between the doctor's intention in withholding life support versus assisted death.
Okay, thank you. You know, that's such an important issue to be really clear on. And one of the reasons why it's so important is because those who've argued for assisted death have argued that there's no significant difference between withholding or withdrawing life support and actually administering a lethal dose of a medication. And that was one of the factors that convinced one of the Superior Court judges in BC that this was reasonable to legalize, since it's already been going on for years. So the critical issue, as I said, is that when you administer euthanasia or give someone a prescription that they can self-administer, you are doing that with the express goal of causing death. That's your intention. That's the point of what you're doing. When I take someone off of life support, the point of what I am doing is recognizing that it's been an ongoing therapy that's no longer working, and therefore it's pointless to continue it. Moreover, it's burdensome and invasive, and the patient doesn't want it anymore. And in the face of that, for me to continue doing it would be an assault on them. So when I take the breathing tube out and give the patient medicine to take away shortness of breath, I have no desire for them to die. I'm not trying to end their life. I'm just recognizing that this intervention is not working anymore, and that I want to shift the goals of care to making sure that whatever time they have left is comfortable and respects and maximizes their dignity. Now, sometimes that means they only have minutes left after I take the breathing tube out. Sometimes it's hours, sometimes it's days, sometimes it's weeks. But nevertheless, the point in doing so is not to end their life. I've never done it in order to end somebody's life. And so the goal is very, very different, and that's the crucial distinction. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Are there other questions from the audience that someone would like to ask? Feel free to raise your hand. Excellent.
All right, I think we have a question at the back and then a question up at the front as well, Darius.
Hi. My question for you is, you had mentioned that John Piper had this term of affliction and suffering as the eternal weight of glory. I'm wondering if you could unpack that a bit more.
So, wow, that's a profound question. And John, you're the one with the degree in theology. So, but nevertheless, I mean, I think that it's interesting because in the New Testament, consistently the authors, when speaking about the ultimate end of salvation, use this idea of glory. So you have Paul in Romans 8 talking about a future expectation of glory. You have Peter in 1 Peter and several places in that book, which is all about the suffering of Christians for the sake of the church. Again and again saying this is worth it because we're looking forward to glory. And I think that when in their minds, when they're writing about glory, they would have had in mind many of the Old Testament passages that describe the future hope of God's people. So for example, if you go to Isaiah, there is this expectation that there will come a day when God will completely end all suffering and all pain. There's a beautiful passage in Isaiah 25 that talks about God making a feast of marrow at the top of a mountain as sort of this picture of absolute riches and satisfaction. And there's so many places in the book of Isaiah actually where this idea of glory is unpacked. So that's just a beginning to start to answer your question. But I think that as Christians need a very rich theology of suffering, if we're going to call one another to continue living in the face of suffering, and to unpack the weight of glory is exactly how we go about developing that theology.
I think there's a question in the front somewhere. Just want to raise your hand. Right in front.
Okay, so my question is a sort of a practical question in that if we buy your assumption that the majority of the Canadian public is secular and that the bioethics committee is secular, and that also if we buy the argument that we can't conclusively settle to everyone's satisfaction the existence of God in a night or even a series of nights, I'm struggling to understand how your argument of just pitting one assumption against another will actually have any functional results. How does that actually impact the bioethics community if, as you say, it's a secular community that is unlikely to give credence to the Christian ethics?
That's a great question. And I'm glad you asked because I think that's a critical issue that needs to get worked out. I think I think I would recognize that in pointing out the secular assumptions underlying the case, I am not claiming that most Canadians are secular because that would actually be false. Nor am I claiming that most members of the bioethics community are secular in their general worldview. I do not know if that's the case or not. It might be. However, what I am claiming is that when you read the case, the assumptions are made according to these secular humanistic ideas about the basis for right and wrong, and what the meaning of life is, etc., and the nature of what it's like to be dead. And the important and the functional impact of discussing these assumptions is it undermines the moral imperative that Christian physicians, irrespective of their own beliefs, ought to help patients access assisted death. If it could be definitively proved that this was a good thing to do, then Christian physicians ought to do it. But in as much as I'm pointing out that it cannot be definitively proved that it is a good thing to do, in fact, there are good reasons to doubt that, there's no particular imperative on Christian physicians to do it. So that's the kind of objection issue. And secondly, I think it helps people to see why it is that different parties can arrive at such different conclusions on this issue. Why is it that Christians call themselves compassionate and yet don't provide assisted death? It's because we understand the meaning of life and death and who we are and where our value comes from very differently. And in fact, we have good reasons for those beliefs, such that our beliefs can simply be set aside or disregarded without serious critique. And in my experience, in this matter of assisted death, there has been no debate essentially about whether or not this was a good thing to do. That debate never happened. It never happened in my medical community. It may have happened in some. But essentially, there's just been essentially a move to say this is what we're going to do and we need to go about it. And so in helping people to understand why we're resistant, we need to be very clear about what the real issues are at stake. So fundamentally, just to sum up, the assumptions are important because A, they undermine the case for assisted death and the moral imperative attached to it, and B, they help people to understand why we're opposed.
We have a couple of questions coming in on the phone. I'd like to, two of them are on a similar topic, both coming in from medical professionals. Ewan, in terms of providing compassionate care from a Christian perspective, that's going to take a lot of time and energy from you as a physician. How does a Christian physician provide that care to the patient who needs it without neglecting other patients or even coming across as callous and burned out?
Yeah, I totally understand. And I'm not in a position, my area of practice in the ICU is unique in some respects that when I'm on call, almost all my time is devoted to 15 or 16 patients. Very different than having a practice with thousands of patients and running around. I don't know. I would suggest that maybe as Christians we need to think about cutting back on the number of patients that we see so that we can focus on the ones that we have. I suppose that'd be one thing. That means a cut in our income, which is the main driver of why, or sometimes it can be a driver of why people have large, flourishing practices. But I'm not in a position to offer judgments on how exactly Christian physicians should respond to. I think everyone needs to look at their own life, their practice, and figure out the best way of doing that.
Thank you. I think we have a question. Okay.
So, based on what we believe as Christians, when it comes back to the question of, is death good for you? Really, from a Christian, this is just a comment more than anything, it's from a Christian doctor's perspective. If you know the person's not a Christian, I don't think that's a good thing for them. And I guess to add a question to this comment, have you seen when people have died different reactions between people who you knew to be Christians who died and people who were very much alienated away from God when they died?
I think there's a large body of literature on associations between religious belief and health outcomes, much of it supportive. My only reservation is that those are associations, not necessarily evidence of causation. In my experience, to be honest with you, I haven't had, I could probably count on both hands the number of cases I've dealt with where I knew for sure that the family and the patient all were held what we would consider to be evangelical Christian belief. There is no doubt in my mind that those situations went smoothly and people were accepting and able to cope in a way that was healthy. To be honest though, there are many other belief systems that people resort to that help them to cope with. So I wouldn't draw a clear parallel between Christian belief and a good death necessarily. Sufficient, but maybe not necessary condition. But that's not meant to answer the question of course, of which one's true and which one's false. It's a totally different question.
Ewan, we have a question coming in, and I think it's probably sitting in this room as well. The question of effective referral. How are Christian physicians, how would you suggest Christian physicians respond to the requirement for effective referral?
So just to be upfront, I'm opposed to offering an effective referral, and here's why. So insofar as we are opposed to assisted death and hold that it's the wrong thing to do, we do not want to be complicit in facilitating or making available this option. And it's very important to understand exactly what a referral is in medicine. A referral is not just sort of handing out information. It is an action whereby you are commending a patient to another doctor to receive something that you are in support of in general. And if I send a patient to a physician to do something that's unethical, and I know that they're going to do that, and I know that the patient's going to receive it, I will be held legally accountable. And ethically accountable. So, for example, the easy one to cite is if a young woman comes to me or her father says, with her father, and her father says she needs to be circumcised. If I was to refer her to a physician who would perform that, I would be ethically accountable for the fact that happened. I'm facilitating, I'm helping, I'm supporting. So a referral makes one legally and ethically complicit in the action. So I don't think that we can take the easy route and just say, oh, an effective referral, no big deal. Even if the College of Physicians seems to want to suggest that it's not that big of a deal, it's very reasonable for us to take a stand on this. Now, I think, just to expand on this a little bit, one very practical way in which Christians can address the issue of assisted death is to support those bodies who are actively campaigning for the right of conscientious objection to referrals. So I would encourage you all, when you leave here, to go to canadiansforconscience.ca, and that website gives you, if you haven't already been there, lets you very quickly notify your MP and other responsible individuals about your stance on this issue. And you can also be in prayer for the Christian Medical and Dental Society, which is has already taken legal action and is moving towards doing so again, in order for Christians to be able to have their constitutional rights to practice in accordance with their conscience. So these are complicated issues, and many people think that it's selfish and unprofessional to allow your Christian beliefs to influence the way you practice medicine. But my response would be that if that's the case, then it's also selfish and unprofessional to allow your secular beliefs to influence the way you practice medicine. There is no neutrality, and that's so important for people to see, because our culture just does not see that. They just take their assumptions for granted.
Before we take a question from the floor, I just wanted to remind everyone of the phone number if they wanted to send questions in. It's 416-830-0335. 416-830-0335. Joe, I think you had a question.
Just a comment and a question. I'm a physician practicing respirology in the community, so I have opportunities to follow patients after they're discharged from hospital or the ICU. And one of the things that I do, since I've heard you talk about providing compassion towards people who are dying and suffering with them, is to simply follow them. Simply, after a diagnosis of cancer, after a diagnosis of pulmonary fibrosis, it's so easy to refer them to a palliative care team and say, okay, you're done now. But it's meaningful, although you're not doing much, to actually see them in the clinic month after month, every 2 months, every month even, to provide that care, adjust very little things, or adjusting puffers, or adjusting morphine doses, but I think that's meaningful. And if you're a professional in the position of to be able to provide that kind of care, setting apart time to do that, I think, would be some minor changes you can make to make that meaningful. The question I had was, can you, just so that the general public understand, give us an example of what a typical order, a cocktail for a palliative care patient, let's say a 80-year-old patient who's dying of lung cancer on the ward, okay, versus, like, for example, morphine and maybe some Ativan and whatever, right? Versus what cocktail and doses you would use for a 40-year-old person who has, let's say, a brain cancer, who is probably not going to die for another 6 months or so, requesting PAD.
Yeah. Well, I think you kind of suggested the cocktail there for the elderly patient on the ward. I guess, well, I don't know how you feel, Jung, but I think it probably might be prudent not to get into the details of exactly what one would take or how much, etc., just in case that kind of information is disseminated. I think the college has gone to some lengths to make sure that only physicians can access that kind of information. So, but I'll just tell you that, of course, the doses that would be used for assisted death are much larger, like obscenely much larger compared to what one would use normally in practice, potentially depending on how much someone needed for pain control. And that just simply reflects the fact that the intention of the use of those agents is very different.
All right, I think we have a question over here.
A lot of your contents tonight seems to revolve around the aspect of physical assisted death. And I was wondering, what is your take on, let's say, mentally assisted death? I'm not sure if you could maybe expand on that tonight. But let's say, for example, someone who's going through severe depression, has lost the ability to live, and perhaps the symptoms of those are not as obvious as someone, let's say, going through cancer or bleeding to death.
So I think the case that we laid out, it holds with respect to all forms of suffering. I wasn't meaning to treat the issue of physical pain. I do acknowledge that physical pain is much easier to manage and treat than mental pain or existential pain. Those are, as I pointed out at the beginning, there are great limitations to what medicine can do. We cannot avoid suffering entirely, and there's no question that people with chronic severe depression suffer greatly. The Christian view of compassion, nevertheless, is to value that person as someone who is made in the image of God, has transcendent value, created for something far greater, that their suffering reflects the brokenness of the world, and that we're prepared to love them and journey with them through that and do everything in our power to know that, so that they can know that they're loved. And that's a very difficult thing to do. It's not just a job for doctors or nurses, it's a job for all of us to be about. But to take that person and say, yeah, you're right, your life isn't worth living, here's the medication you want, is tacitly to say, that they're not worth loving in that way.
Okay, we're coming close to the end of our evening, so we'll take one or two questions from the floor and then one more from the phone. Come up here. Did you have a follow-up question?
Sorry, I had just one follow-up question. Just to clarify your position, so do you have an objection? You clearly have an objection to physician-assisted death, but do you have an objection to it being applicable to a physician choice? Or do you have, for example, an objection to a scenario in which physicians have the right to choose whether or not they act in that manner, or even if, even in regards to referral, if they can choose not to do so? And would you have an objection to the public allowing for other physicians to choose to do so? Or are you saying that there should be a universal removal of physician-assisted death?
I've really struggled with that question, and I'm going to say I don't entirely know the answer. To me, that is not an ethical question so much as it's a political question. It's a question about to what extent do we expect people outside of our community of assumptions and beliefs to behave as if our assumptions and beliefs are true. I do not really expect my colleagues who are atheists or functional atheists to behave as if Christianity is true. I don't think I can expect that of them. So the question as to whether this should be a legally available option, even if it's not ethical, I honestly, I really struggle with that question, and I'm not sure how to answer it. One thing I do know for sure, though, is that inasmuch as some have the liberty to provide this, those of us who are opposed should have the liberty not to provide it. To me, that seems very clear from the limitations of the ethical case for assisted death. The political question, I think, is a very challenging one that I haven't resolved yet.
All right, we have one question back here.
You talked about autonomy. Do you think that this will open the physician-assisted death will open a door to other, like mercy killing or euthanasia for those who have no autonomy, like like for those who are developmentally disabled or those who have dementia, but they're suffering in a different way. Do you think that this will open a door for people who have that kind of disability too? That people will use all their suffering as a way for their power of attorney to
I think there's a spectrum of opinion on this in the community of those who are opposed to assisted death. I think it's possible that things could move in that direction. That said, everyone I know who is supportive of assisted death strongly holds to the idea that this ought to be the exercise of the patient's active autonomous preference. I wouldn't be surprised if a few years from now a substitute decision maker could make the decision on behalf of a patient, since we already rely on substitute decision makers for many important medical decisions. It seems arbitrary and inconsistent to preclude substitute decision making from the matter of assisted death. And when that becomes the case, then I think in the ICU this is going to become more of a problem. But for the moment, people seem to be generally opposed to that. For sure, there are examples I know of in Belgium in particular where there are cases of non-voluntary euthanasia in the course of delivering end-of-life ICU care. I can think of, there's people on the record about that. So there is a slippery slope, no doubt, but knowing my colleagues who are in support of this, I think they would fight those kinds of trends fairly aggressively. But it's hard to know where things are going to go.
Great. One last question from the floor.
I just want to begin by thanking you for the talk tonight. It's been very thought-provoking. My question actually relates to two of the others that have been asked. The first one about effective referral and the second one about universal legality. I was reading the Globe and Mail today that there's a coalition, a group of you that are trying to avoid the need to make that referral, and an alternate proposition for an online registry or something of that likeness has been put out there. Do you agree with that? Is that the ideal? Is that where you would like to see things go? Mm-hmm. That instead of making a referral, you can just say, check online, find a doctor for yourself, mm-hmm. and pursue that option independently.
Yeah. Those of us who are opposed to assisted death and to effective referral are not opposed to talking with patients about this option. In fact, if a patient wants it, I think we want to know that, because it allows us the opportunity to understand exactly why they're looking for this, what it is that drives that. It gives us an opportunity to prevent. But also, I think that, the fact that it's a known legal option, that we do respect people as free agents who make moral choices for themselves. We're willing to have the conversation and even to give them information about what it involves. So we're not trying to unduly obstruct people from access to something that's legally permissible. And I think the position that the Christian Medical and Dental Society has taken is most reasonable on this point. If there is a hotline that patients can call, there's a hotline for doctors, there's no hotline for patients in Ontario. There are hotlines for patients in other provinces. An online registry of doctors who provide this would be nice. I suspect that most who provide don't want their names out in public, just because, again, it's a personal decision. So it's challenging, but there are ways forward that are not difficult to operationalize. And we're hopeful that those who are in the position to formulate these policies will be willing to consider our requests.
All right, Ewan, before we close, just one question for you. You, towards the end of your talk, gave a hopeful picture and idea of Christian ministry being a ministry of compassion to these people who would otherwise be seeking their own death. Briefly, what would that look like? What is your vision for that, and how can we get on board?
Darius, that's the $1 million question. That's why at the end of the talk I said that in the weeks and months to come, people need to work out the practical implications of what I was saying. I think, fundamentally, it's spending time with those who are suffering, just being present, like Young was talking about, seeing the patient for the sake of just seeing them. Just being in their presence, knowing they're not alone, they're loved, they're valued, they're important, they're treasured. I think Christians can really get behind, there's home hospice option. I understand there's actually an organization that works with churches to establish home hospice type operations. But it doesn't even have to be in the context of church work. It can just be really getting engaged in end-of-life care and going to nursing homes and spending time with people. People need love. Our culture is crying out for love. And the gospel is the greatest message of love that there is. And we have this treasure in jars of clay, like it says in 2 Corinthians. So spreading that message and spending time with those who are suffering, I think, is the most practical place to begin.
Thank you. I'm getting the stink eye from Joe. So if you'd like to join me in thanking Dr. Ewan Goligher for his contribution. So thank you to all of you who come out tonight to engage with this topic. I think it's really important that as Christians, even if there are non-Christians here, that we engage with this topic. It's very hot at the moment, but not because it's popular or contemporary, but because it will impact all of our lives at the moment. So thank you again, and I don't think I have any further instructions for tonight, so enjoy your evening and have a safe journey.